Revelation 1:3 actually assumes the world in which a text is read to others. And so most folks would have experienced, I think Luke's Acts was probably done this way, is that it was actually read at certain dinner parties, and folks who wanted a copy, by the way, if you wanted a copy of Revelation, or you wanted a copy of Revelation after, or Acts or any other book after a hearing of it, you would have normally have paid for the scribe that would copy it from the owner. And while there were bookshops in the ancient world, there weren't lots of them. Most folks received their books and literature by making a copy from someone who owned a copy. So that gives you some insights into how Scripture is going to be transmitted through time. And so what did writing look like? We're going to be looking eventually at Philemon. Paul will sometimes write a book with his own name, and then sometimes he'll have multiple authors. And some folks who've explored the way that these ancient letters were written suggest that, for example, Philemon is Paul and Timothy to Philemon. And so scholars have suggested we ought to take this dual authorship thing seriously. So there's places in the text where it looks like there's a little bit of disjuncture, may actually be places where Paul with his associates are actually coming up with the wording and not just Paul only. And so often when you're reading Paul, it's pretty clear that you're hearing Paul's voice primarily, but why list a co-author if the co-author did nothing but just sit there? So maybe there's something to it. I'm not sure we're always going to be able to see it when we're reading a text, but also we need to remember is that when particularly these long letters of Paul's, they probably were not written in a single setting. And so there's times when, in fact, at the end of 1 Corinthians, if you take a look at the end of 1 Corinthians, you'll find Paul just hitting kind of random topics before he closes the letter out. That's possibly because he doesn't have a messenger yet, and he thinks of something else he wants to add to the letter, which we know did happen in ancient letter writing. So you don't close a letter until you've secured a messenger. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So you kind of leave the ending kind of dangling a little bit. Other information might come along. So I've talked about this before, but Paul probably didn't write in a quiet room with a desk. Chances are he if he did have a tabletop, it would have been the working station where he was making tents. So Paul was a tent maker, and so if he lived in the houses associated with those shops, it would have been several people living in the same space, small tenement housing, probably not safe at all, but it would have been a noisy world in which these letters would have been written. And so, by the way, the earliest pictures we have of scribes, I don't know why they didn't use a tabletop, but they're actually using their knee. They're writing on their, that's why their bodies hurt. Some of the scribes who actually left us notes in their manuscripts will say, I'm so glad this manuscript is over. My body hurts all over. Those kind of notes. Those notes actually show up from time to time in the manuscripts. And so, again, there's so many things that are kind of culturally framed that this is how we've always done it kind of thing is true in the ancient world too. So, and then the use of scribes. Unless you knew a scribe, you had to employ one. And you could find one at the local marketplace in ancient Greek cities. And so the scribe was a position because all kinds of documents needed to be created, and you paid a scribe by line. And some of our manuscripts actually have the lines underscored with little dots at the end of each line because they're counting the line because that's the way the scribe was paid. And so we actually have indicators of that with some of the manuscripts that have actually come down to us, some of the earliest manuscripts. But these scribes were not cheap. And so if you needed a document, like you needed a deed or something pretty official, you're going to go to the scribe to get a copy so that you've got something official. And so Paul, in fact, there's evidence all the way through the New Testament that scribes were in fact used. They could have been Christians who were willing to donate their time too. For example, a slave or a former slave named Tertius, Tertius is the nice Latin way of saying third. He's number 3. That's his name, number 3. So we're pretty certain he was a slave or had been a slave. But he's the one who actually does the work on Romans. He actually picks up the pen and signs off. I, Tertius, wrote this letter. He tells you that he's doing. Now, it's still Paul's letter, but it is the scribe who's actually either transcribing it or using, which is also possible, using the notes that Paul may have put on a wax tablet, which was a standard way in ancient first century, is to use a wax tablet to do your first draft, because the tablets you could basically smooth them out and use them over again. Yeah. By the way, the tablets were often multiple frames with a binder or a ring to hold them together, and so they actually kind of look like a book. Hold on to that thought because it'll come up again, because I think it might be the inspiration for what becomes a book. So it is obvious that Silas, his Latin name Silvanus, helped write First Peter. Scribes' names there. And then there's several cases like the end of Second Thessalonians and the end of Galatians, where Paul actually says, I, Paul, signed this with my own hand, where Paul is basically saying, I picked up the pen at this point so that the original readers would know that it was from Paul. And Paul even complains about letters going out in his name in Second Thessalonians. And so one of the ways that Paul tried to guarantee the authenticity, at least of the first round of his letter, is that he would actually pick up the pen and sign that part of it. When Paul says in Galatians, see what large letters I'm using, he's probably telling you he's not a very good pen. He doesn't have really, really good penmanship. He writes really big. But the fact that Paul is picking up the pen and signing it there is a good indication that somebody else wrote the previous, or Paul wouldn't have had to say that. A guy by the name of Richard did some studies in ancient scribal practices and how much it actually would cost to write these documents. And first time I saw this, I was both enlightened and amazed. But this was his best guess at what it would have cost in the ancient world to do the number of lines that each of these letters presuppose. So Romans, obviously one of the longest one, would have cost roughly $2,200 in today's currency. And these are American dollars too. And so there's the amount that it would have cost in the ancient world, dinars. And here's roughly what it would be equivalent to today. And so this was not a small undertaking. And so,
Dr. Houghton, sorry to interrupt. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. If you got somebody asking a question.
I did. Sorry, my microphone lagged. Yes, Karen has a question. She said, what did they use to write with and what did they write on?
Okay, I'll get to that here in a minute. Thank you for asking what's coming up. So you're in the same vein, and that's really important, I think, to know. So I just want you to look that even Philemon, a small letter, would have still cost about $101 to produce. What was involved in actually writing and sending a letter? Well, if you were the sender, you would make a copy and then you would find someone to carry the letter. I want you to understand this. There's this notion that, and this comes out of 19th century theology and the need to define inspiration, is that there were no errors in the original autographs, is what you'll hear sometimes. And the autograph is a way to refer to the original single document. There was no single document. Nearly everything started out as a pair. And if you think about it, it makes so much sense. There was a copy that was kept and there was a copy that was sent. And so all of these documents, and that's presupposed in Richard's numbers earlier, is there would have been two copies. One of the ways that we've actually collected, like we've got the ancient writings of Cicero, is because they were in duplicate. There was Cicero's copy, and then one of his friends, Atticus, had the other copies. And so there, in the ancient world, you could sometimes make a complete collection if you could get access to both sets. And so you could actually pull together a full collection, because once you lose both of them, they're gone forever. So we know that sending the letter involved making a copy and finding someone to carry the letter. The work of the carrier was to deliver the letter. And from what we can tell, and it seems often the case, and Paul seems to presuppose it in his letter, is that the messenger will actually interpret and fill in the gaps. How many times does Paul say, oh yeah, when Tychicus gets there, he'll tell you the other things? And you're going, no, but we want to know the other things. We want to know them. And so it is consistent with the practice in the ancient world, particularly if you were able to find a carrier that you trust. And by the way, you didn't have access to a postal system unless you were government. The government did have a postal system, but only officials could use it. And so everybody else that was sending letters or packages or anything in the ancient world, they do it the Canadian way. They find the next person that's headed to Regina or whatever city you're in. So this sounds very familiar to Canadians, because anytime folks hear me hear where I'm traveling, I get, oh, could you take? And of course I can. Which means that Paul nearly always finds a recipient or a carrier that he trusts. It's one of his workers, one of the colleagues with him. Yeah. Probably the most interesting one to sort out is Phoebe appears to be the letter carrier for Romans. And chapter 16 appears to be the letter recommendation that gets her into the places where she needs to read the letter. I don't know what we did before we knew this information about the recommendation at the end of Romans, but it occurs in Romans 16, and it clearly is a recommendation letter for Phoebe, who is, we think, the carrier of the document we call Romans today. Interesting other questions coming up. I see another question up there, but I haven't looked at the chat. Anything else?
No, that was just Karen saying thank you. But I wanted to ask you, am I remembering wrong? Was it the Apostle Paul where didn't he say, hey, can you send my sweater back or my tunic or something?
Oh, he does something like that. He does something like that in is it Titus or Timothy, about gather my parchments together, especially, no, he says the manuscripts, especially the parchment. And oh, by the way, bring my coat to me.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but that gives you, I think, a really kind of personal look at how first of all, how the Christian community worked in the first century, but how things got passed back and forth. So. I'm going to get to writing material, Karen, so don't give up on me yet, but let's stay on this. At some point in history, someone had to make the decision that Paul's letters were worth collecting. And so, under the best scenario, Paul would have kept a copy of the letters he sent, and then each of the churches would have copies. And Paul also encourages within his lifetime for his letters to be copied and sent to other churches, or the actual letter to be sent to another church to be read. And so we know that this active copying of Paul's letters that were written specifically to one church was also shared with other churches. And you'll see notes to that effect. In fact, there is a letter to the Laodiceans that's mentioned in the New Testament that we don't have unless, and I think we do have it actually, I think it's the letter to the Ephesians. The letter to the Ephesians appears to be a circular letter because some of the early manuscripts do not have the phrase "in Ephesus" in it. And if you take that little phrase out, it becomes a circular letter to anybody that wants it. So it could be the letter that is mentioned to the letter that went to the Laodiceans. It's in the right area? Could be. Not going to swear. We do know from Paul's own comments that we have letters that did not come down to us. For example, 1 Corinthians is really at best 2 Corinthians, because Paul actually mentions in 1 Corinthians a previous letter. And so there does appear that not all of the letters that Paul wrote got collected together. And I'm just going to talk about the human side of how these things came together as opposed to the divine side, just so we can talk process. So I feel pretty confident we have what God wants. So I'm not concerned about that. So I'm wanting us just to have a sense of the process. God, in his infinite wisdom, tends to use human processes in so many things. So somebody would have gathered copies of Paul's letter together. Someone would have probably sorted through which letters actually came from Paul and which one didn't, since we know that there were letters floating around in Paul's name. None of those have survived, but Paul gives evidence that they did exist. So chances are who's ever collecting Paul's letters did. And then there is the arranging of Paul's letters in the particular order that they show up in now. And I think I've shared this with you before. Here's the amazing ordering of Paul's letters. You ready for this one? Longer before shorter. Letters to churches before letters to people. Did you get both of those principles? It's deeply theological, can't you see? It is nice that Romans comes right after the book of Acts, because where is Paul at the end of the book of Acts? He's under house arrest at Rome. And so it kind of makes a nice move in the arrangement that we've come down with. But and if you're a collector of Paul's letters, you have to decide what you're going to do with Hebrews. And we do have some manuscripts in which Hebrews is second. That arrangement is assuming that Hebrews is by Paul. In other arrangements in manuscript, Hebrews is last, but always circulated, and this is important, always circulated with Paul's letters. And let me tell you what I mean by circulated. These gospel manuscripts, particularly the earliest ones, were done in sets. For example, the gospels were all kept together. Early on, Luke and Acts were separated. The next collection was the Pauline collection, which always included Hebrews. The next collection was what we call the Catholic or the general epistles. James, 1st, 2nd John, 1st, 2nd Peter, those. And oddly enough, Acts always circulated with them. Don't ask me why. Hey, I didn't invent the manuscripts. That's how they come down to us. And the book of Revelation has its own textual history because it was never transmitted early on as part of any of the collection. It kind of had its own story. And so when you look at how the various materials were passed down to us, those groupings were intact very early by the 1st, 2nd century. We've got the Gospels, we've got Paul, we've got the Catholic epistles with Acts, and then we got the book of Revelation. But again, remember, somebody's thinking about this, particularly as we move away from scrolls. And I'll tell you more about that here in a little bit. If you absolutely love this kind of information and want more of it, here's your book. E. Randolph Richard wrote a book called Paul in First Century Letter Writing. And he basically uses the information that he gets from other classical sources about letter collecting and writing. And he begins to ask, particularly Cicero. Cicero's kind of his main source. And he goes through and he reads everything in Cicero's letters that give a hint to how letters were done. And then he asks the question, with what I know from this, is this also true of the New Testament? And so that's basically his research question, was the New Testament passed down as other literature was passed down? I think there's some wrinkles there, because I think we know for certain that some of the early churches actually did keep a library, a small library, probably modeled off the Jewish synagogue that also kept a cabinet where Torah and prophets and the writings were kept. Okay, Karen, you've waited too long. Here it is. By the way, this is a famous drawing of a man and his wife who are a scribal couple. That's what they do. You'll notice that he has a scroll with a tag on it. By the way, that little tag underneath his chin, that is a title tag. That is where you put the title of the work, and the scrolls would go in a cubby and the tag would hang out, and that's how they identified the works. Graham, are you able to see that? Is it large enough? I'll make sure I'll send the text to it. It's this particular I want a portrait is one of those that was found at Vesuvius, and so it's the result of the eruption. So it was found at Pompeii, and so it's pretty contemporary with the first century. And so you'll see that she's holding a stylus to her. A stylus would be what she would dip into the ink to write the letters. So what did they write on? Some of our oldest writings on clay, we're way past that by the time we get to the first century. And then there were these wax tablets that were used in the educational system in Rome that we know about. And so there would be a layer of wax that could be written on and then smoothed out and reused. But the standard writing material of the first century is papyrus, which is a reeded plant from Egypt that somebody found out that you could take and you could crisscross the leaves and glue them together. In fact, the glue is the actual the natural excretions from the plant. And you could take one side of it and smooth it off and make a smooth surface for writing. And so generally, you only wrote on one side. So when you hear something that's written on both sides in the ancient world, they're trying to tell you that it was important enough that we had to find a way to write on the side we wouldn't normally write on. But generally, it was one side that was smoothed off for the paper for it, and it creates a paper-like surface that you can write on. And then the scribes would actually underscore or score with a ruler. They would put straight lines on it to keep the text straight. So when you look at ancient texts, it looks like they're writing like incredibly straight. Well, it's because the original probably had a little crease in there that's made by the stylist to create the line on which they're writing, which of course over time begins to disappear a bit, but sometimes we can still see that. If something was, by the way, papyrus is the general material for scrolls. Scrolls were made 30, 35 feet long so that you could roll them. If something was valuable enough, you put it on parchment, and parchment is animal hides. It's smoothed out animal hides. In fact, lots of the New Testament manuscripts that have come down to us, the really nice one, they're on skin. And by the way, with recent DNA tests, they've actually been able to locate where some of the manuscripts, where those cows came from. Yeah, so and it doesn't take much of a sample. So there's not, carbon-14 dating was always too much of a sample. And so, but you need a really small sample in order to do DNA studies. And so, they've actually determined that some of the hides came from sick cows. And so all kinds of interesting things you find, but it also gives you, with carbon-14, we can sometimes date these things, within 50 years of when they had to be used. So that's kind of cool. So, but parchment makes in fact, I'm going to show you some samples of the books here. There was, obviously with the clay, you had something more of a stylus, or maybe even almost a really thin chisel kind of thing that you used. The neat thing about the clay tablets is once they were cured, once they were cooked, baked, they last a long time, as the evidence is. We've got all kinds of ancient evidence from the Middle East, so. But I want to talk about the tablet because there came a point at which books moved from scrolls to what we call codices or codex. A codex is just the old word for a book. And we'll talk a little more about that as we get to it. But here's some evidence from the New Testament to show you that these things, by the way, here's that text you were thinking about, Jana. Bring the cloak that I left in with Carpus at Troas, also the books. the books here would be scrolls. Scrolls would actually be the best translation for that word. Biblion nearly always means scrolls in the first century. Biblion, by the way, is the Greek word we get Bible from. Biblion. But of all, bring the parchments, and the Greek word there is membrana, membranes. Kind of makes sense if you're using animal skins. Then there's a couple of items in 2nd John and 3rd John that talks about writing materials. I have much to write to you, but I would rather not use paper. And here the word is cartes, which is any kind of writing construction, but probably papyrus. And then melis is just black ink, which was often made of soot and other things. So anything they could get a dark, a dark pigment in. So, and then in the next letter, he uses, instead of the same word for ink, he uses pen. Kalamos and ink. And of course, ink is the same word as melis, dark coloring. So even the New Testament gives evidence of this process kind of incidentally. Any questions at this point? Oh, there's 6 comments. Anything I need to chase, Jana?
No.
You're keeping me on it. Okay, don't insult anybody by not chasing their question, all right?
Absolutely not.
Well, let's play a little bit. Here is a piece of papyrus. This is one of the oldest papyrus manuscripts that we have. It is Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Notice that several things. First of all, notice the straight lines I've already told you about. Notice also that the title is really simple. Up at the top, it gives, by the way, you guys can see my cursor, right? That's a page. That's a page number right there in the folio. That's by the way, which means this was a codex, not a scroll. By the way, I'll be happy to send this to you. And the title is just simply Pros Ephesios, which is to the Ephesians. That's it. That's the title. And again, notice that I told you we could do about a 50-year dating range. This one dates approximately 175 to 225 is when this one was copied. So the scribe would have had a previous copy, which, by the way, leads us to 2 dates. There's the date of the actual manuscript, and there's the date of the text. Did you feel that? The text is always older than the manuscript on which it is written, because it's made from a copy. It's made from an exemplar. This one's early enough. It could be a copy of an original, but I'm thinking it's probably 2 generations away. Notice that the reeded material, you can actually see the sense of crisscross, the leaves that are crisscross. And notice how as it tatters at the bottom, you can see it pulling apart. And so you get the real sense that it's made out of these reeded plants, but you do see the crisscross here in the material. How long would this last? Regular use, we know that they lasted for as much as 300 years. But you can well imagine if you're using this thing in a rigorous way, in a daily way, it's going to wear out quickly. And so you've got to have a writing process that's copying for the next generation at least every 100 years. So that gives you a sense of that. Not only is this pretty close to how Paul's letter probably looked originally, it also gives us a sense of how it's being passed down through time. No printing presses yet. Any questions there?
Yes, one just came in from Karen.
Yes.
Karen said, and the other things you saw in your little icon was Karen thanking you and saying how cool she thought that like certain things you're doing were. Okay. But anyway, her question now is, how did they know it was an original? Sorry, a bit off topic, Karen says.
It didn't matter if it was an original, because as long as they believed it to be a copy of the original, they were fine with it. Also, because it's a human process, it is the copying that creates what we're going to call variants. if you just try this, in fact, I do this in classes. I have a class, take First John in English and say, write it out exactly as it looks on the text. And it's amazing how many mistakes we enter for lots of reasons. And so, but those mistakes are generally easy to see, because if we've got a sense of what the text is supposed to say, when we put an error, when we create an error that makes a text nonsensical, then we know there's been a mistake. And so there's telltale signs that we have in the copying process. So in the life of the church, Karen, the way this would happen is they would copy something they've been using for 100 years or more. So I don't think they'd ever question whether or not they had the original text. That is the text on the manuscript. I'm not sure anybody could be certain they had an original unless they had the one that had Paul's writing at the bottom. Because obviously the scribe's going to copy what Paul wrote, but it's going to be in the scribe's text instead of Paul's, right? So notice also that there are no gaps between the letters. So they expect the reader of the document to be able to know Greek well enough to know where the word breaks are. And again, this is actually a space-saving device. Another space-saving device is, and I don't know if you can see this, but you notice these words, you'll notice words that have lines over them. There's several of them along the way. These are abbreviations. So certain words, particularly words that showed up a lot, particularly the holy words that showed up a lot, were abbreviated. And so they were called nomina sacra, holy names. And so this is the style that would have been predominant in although there's a cursive script, most of them are capital letters. All right. In time, the copying process becomes a little fancier and a little more sophisticated. And so by the 5th century, a manuscript now looks like this. And this is one of the earliest editions that we have that has the complete Bible in it. And so by the time we get to the 5th century, there is an attempt to bring all of the Bible under a single cover. And by the way, what you see in front of you here is Hebrews and the end of Philemon. No, 2 Thessalonians. Let me not lie to you. This is Codex Vaticanus, and it's been preserved at the Vatican for years and years, but only became available to the larger public in 1880. And so it is an early manuscript of which the King James translators obviously did not have access to. It is a beautiful manuscript, and as you can tell, it is written in 3 columns. But notice here that there is a note right here. And if this is the note that I think it is, it's a place where there's a variant, and the scribe's frustrated because his exemplars have multiple wording. And he basically says, "You fools, leave the text alone." So it's kind of a grumble or a rant towards the previous folks that had the manuscript. But you'll notice that you'll get this marginal note occasionally where the scribe is really trying to help the reader. Occasionally later on, when this manuscript was copied, sometimes these marginal texts could end up in the text because the next scribe read this as something that was left out of the text. So that did happen occasionally. So this is late 4th century, early 5th century. Another manuscript that I think was copied about the same time is the one that we call Sinaiticus. And this is what it looks like. It's a beautiful book. This is parchment, by the way. If you were able to get up close to it, you could actually see the dimples where the hair was at one point.
What?
There's
The hair was, because it's just
hair. Yeah. It's a beautiful manuscript. By the way, these are available in a facsimile edition today. That is an exact copy of it, but made on today's material. So you can actually buy an exact copy of this today. So again, notice you have marginal notes at the bottom, but notice we're working with 4 columns now instead of 3. Okay. Remember, I told you there was the age of the manuscript and the age of the text. The study of the manuscript is called paleography. Basically, the study of old stuff, right? Old writing, old stuff. And it's the actual study of the material on which the text is written. There is also the study of the text on the manuscripts, and we call that field textual criticism. And that's the area that I did my PhD work in. That's why I know too much about this stuff, because I did a lot of work in it. And it fascinates me because I wanted to answer the question, how do we know this text has been successfully passed down? And I can actually say for sure. Well, having studied these manuscripts and walked through the various ages, the text's pretty solid. There are places where we've got some iffies, but not many. So, okay. Let me teach you some jargon. Every field has jargon, so let me just teach you a minimal amount so that you've got it. Scrolls eventually became codices, is the plural, codex. A codex is simply a book as we know it. But what we don't often think about is that a hardbound book actually has a box around it. I don't know, think about your book and imagine that the sides were closed in. And so what made the codex such an amazing invention, and I do think it's an extension of the Roman tablet that was held together by rings, is that the covers protect the material. Can you imagine how long a scroll would last with all of the handling? And so a codex comes with its own box around it. When we find an ancient piece of writing and it's in Greek and it's on a scroll, we're almost 100% certain it's probably Jewish. Unless, of course, it's Greek, right? Unless it's like a play or something. But if it's Jewish material in Greek, the Jews continued to use the scrolls. The Christians quickly adopted and may have been the first really to adopt what we would call the book. The codex could hold more than a scroll. The scroll was limited to about 30 feet of writing, which, by the way, this model here shows you the seam of the papyrus being sewn together to create the connecting within the scroll. There is only one manuscript of the New Testament that we have that we even suspect that it was written on a scroll. Everything else that's come down to us is in book form. So in some ways, the Christians made the book their way of passing around text. And when you think of a missionary maneuver or a missionary movement, it makes sense to have a box protecting your scrolls. It's also easier to find stuff. Even without verse numbers, it's easier to find stuff in a book than it is a scroll. And so there's lots of advantages to it. Here's what's interesting for at least the 1st or 2nd century is that the classical literature, if it was considered highbrow literature, it was continued on scrolls. The codex was used for more ordinary writings. So it tells you something about how the Christians viewed their book as being useful for every day. Is that interesting? Again, there's so much more we want to know. We don't have a clear information on how writing went straight from a scroll to a book. And of course, scrolls are still produced within the Jewish community today. All right, I'm going to move you to the next slide. The earliest manuscripts were written in what's called an unsealed script. Majuscule is the word that's being preferred among scholars today, but the word we used for years and years. Unsealed just means capital letters. It's written in capital letters. And here's a sample of a text that shows you. By the way, this text is interesting because it shows you a written correction in between the lines. And so some manuscripts have the original author and somebody who went back through the manuscript and made correcting moves. And so these manuscripts often have the text and a corrector coming in behind to correct the text, which means they're quite aware of how hard it is to get a text 100% accurate when you're copying it by hand. By the time we get to, by the way, this is the kind of writing we find from about the 1st century to say the 5th or 6th century. Once we get to the 8th and 9th century, scribes have moved to a cursive script. And this is largely what we find our 8th, 9th, 10th century manuscripts up until the 15th century 16th century, when we finally get a printing press, right? This is Codex 33. It is one of the most beautiful codices ever printed. It is beautiful. And this is, I'll tell you what this is. This is to the Corinthians, and B indicates that it is the 2nd Corinthians. The B here at the end, the beta, is actually a number. So 1 Corinthians would have this same word here, except it would have an alpha. And once you get used to reading this, it's actually not as hard as it looks, but it does look like a pretty complicated move. Let me take us back to the unsealed text for just a second. We went from this to this. Also, although we probably don't have time to explore too much of this, is that we end up increasingly getting art on the slide and around the text, and later with the Gospels we get these, again, just some of the most amazing artwork of the evangelists, etc. So let me introduce you one more thing when it comes to this. We have a large number of Palemsis. You like that word? Palemsis? Palemsis. I've heard it pronounced both ways. Palemsis. These are manuscripts that were scraped off to write another text on top. This material's not cheap. And so if you had a text but needed another text, you would basically smooth off the old text and you would write a new text on top of it. This text is in Latin, by the way, and you can see the text under the text. With our various ways of photographing manuscripts, we can now actually photograph both layers with different kinds of light. We can actually get either one coming out full enough that you can actually transcribe it. By the way, technology is so good that we've taken burned scrolls that are rolled up, and the computer has been able to take MRI style pictures and actually reproduce the whole text, even on a burnt to a crisp manuscript. And so there's some pretty neat things going on from the technology side of things. Texts that were once lost can now be recovered. So that's kind of pretty cool.
Do you have an example of two, like, is there anything that stands out of two texts, like one found underneath another? Like, is there any wow factor that you could share with us?
No, I can't think of one. I mean, if I took a moment to go digging for one, I could probably find one, but it wasn't unusual for an author who wanted a text but only had a copy to have it scraped off. And so there's lots of examples of it. Mm-hmm. But I'm grateful that technology now allows us to capture both text, which is pretty cool. Yeah. At the turn of the last century, let me shift gears now and let's talk about what we know about ancient letters. By the way, I did a very full presentation on manuscripts and the transmission of manuscripts about a year ago. I can't remember where it is, but It should be somewhere in our YouTube. So if you're really interested in learning more about this kind of stuff, what I want you to get a sense of is that you know how Paul's collection, you think about it all the way from the beginning, Paul writing it, sending it by a messenger, it being collected, Paul keeping a copy, and then it being copied by churches. And then eventually the church is copying them in a book, which of course we're going to call the Bible. And that's the way it comes down to us until the printing press. And then with the printing press, we're able to press exact copies over and over again. Although they had to be set up correctly, or you ended up passing down errors even in printed copies, which could still happen today. Editing is one of the most tedious works there is. But at the turn of the last century, so I'm talking about the turn of the 1900s, so let's go way back, a number of papyri documents, so named from the reeded material, were found in Egypt. To the surprise of biblical scholars, some of these letters revealed the same form as found in the New Testament. And so this was the beginning. In fact, at the turn of the last century, it was believed that the New Testament was written with some kind of special Holy Ghost kind of Greek. In fact, that language was actually used. All right, I appreciate the piety of the people who wanted to come up with that. But what we discovered as we read more and more first century documents is that the New Testament is pretty much written in street level Greek of the first century. It's not overly sophisticated Greek, except in a couple of places. Acts is a little hard. Hebrews is really hard, but everything else is pretty much what you would find that average people could understand. Standard Greek stuff. And so we found these letters at a place called Oxyrhynchus. You just wanted to know that, didn't you? It was actually the garbage dump where they found these things. This garbage dump had document after document after document in it. And so they found some of these. And just as our letters today have, dear so-and-so, sincerely from, ancient letters followed a basic form. And some of you have seen this before. I'll just touch it. Most ancient letters look kind of like this. So lo and behold, are you surprised that first century letters that are in our New Testament look something like this? So you can take every letter in the New Testament and basically use this as a way of mapping out what you're seeing in front of you. It also keeps you from making too much of, oh, see, they start with the recipient first. We don't do that, so that must be special. No, that's just the way they did it. Or the sender, the sender's name first. We go, dear so-and-so, and then we don't sign until the end. But this is real useful for example, 1 John is not a letter. You can say that from the beginning because it doesn't have any of these pieces. And so it helps you kind of determine a little bit what you've got in front of you. Could I read to you a couple of letters from the first century? Theon, to the most honored Tyrannus, very many greetings. Heraclitus, the bearer of this letter carrier, isn't that interesting? Heraclitus, the bearer of this letter, is my brother. Wherefore I entreat you with all my power to take him under your protection. I have also asked your brother Hermias by letter to inform you about him. You will do me the greatest favor if you let him win your approval. Before all else, I pray that you may have health and the best success, unharmed by the evil eye. Farewell. And then on the outside of this document, it was addressed to Tyrannus the Diacetus. The reason we don't translate it is we still don't know what it is. We know it's a title, we just don't know what it means. So we leave it like it is. But you actually get the feeling you're reading something very New Testament-like as you're reading this really short little letter from the first century. A little bit later, we get this letter here. Irenaeus to Apollinarius, his dearest brother, many greetings. I pray continually for your health, and I myself am well. I wish you to know that I reached the land on the 6th of the month of Apis, Sorry, I'm going to get that out right here in a second. And we unloaded our cargo on the 18th of the same month. I went to Rome on the 25th of the same month, and the place welcomed us as the God willed, and we are daily expecting our discharge. it so being that up until today, nobody in the corn fleet has been released. Many salutations to your wife and to Serenus and to all who love you, each by name. Goodbye. And then the date of the letter, Masore 9. Really does sound like we're in the world of the New Testament letters. Notice here that we have A to B. We have a prayer wish. We have the body, which is basically an update on why he hasn't been able to come home. And then we have the closing salutations. To all who love you, each by name, which, by the way, happens to be the way John ends a couple of his pieces. Greet the believers by name. And so there's a lot that's very much at home in the 1st and 2nd century. Let me share one more letter with you, which, by the way, happens to be the one that's embedded in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 15, James and the apostles determined to send a letter. I'm not going to read it for you. You've read it again, but I just want to show you that it too is basically the same style of letter. The apostles and elders, your brother to the Gentile believers in the body. There's no prayer, wish, or greeting here, which may mean that the letter is a bit of a summary from the original letter that Luke's just writing the essentials, and it ends with a quick farewell. But again, notice it still follows basically the pattern that we've gotten used to.